2022 was the worst year of my life. As I give this talk in Singapore, my home remains in Sri Lanka. And back home, these last few years have felt like hell. From constitutional crises to some of the most heartbreaking and devastating terrorist attacks, and then the pandemic, my tiny island home has endured it all. And still, Sri Lankans have struggled back on their feet and kept their heads up, my family included. But in 2022, it felt like we were not going to be able to get back up again. After a series of bad economic and political decisions, Sri Lanka was experiencing one of the worst economic crises the region had ever seen. Suddenly, people all around the country were struggling to get food, unable to find petrol. They didn't have gas to cook, and they were spending their days in 11 to 12-hour electricity shortages. Now, I was lucky and privileged enough to have been living and studying abroad while all of this unfolded. But if you have ever been physically separated from a loved one while something bad is happening to them, then you understand the anxiety I felt, the grief I felt for not being there for them, the fear of the unknown. My parents refused to tell me the full extent of what was going on in an effort to try to protect me, and so I began to devour every piece of information that came my way. And trust me, there was a lot of it. When the protests broke out, news immediately covered it. When electricity shortages worsened, global news immediately picked it up. Everywhere I turned, CNN, BBC, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, local news channels, they were all reporting on it. And they all seemed to be saying the same thing, that my country was slowly falling apart. Now, news tends to have a reputation for being incendiary and purposely sensationalistic in an effort to increase viewership. And as I continued to read the news, I clung to the hope that what I was reading was not entirely true, that they were cherry-picking the worst stories and applying it to the whole country. I hoped, and I hoped, and I hoped. And when it was finally time for me to go back to my country during the holidays, I sat in silence on that ride from the airport, and with my heart beating loudly, I looked around at the streets. Everywhere I turned, there was a queue. I turned to my mother, and I hesitantly asked her what they were queuing for. "Petrol," she said. "Oh, so new shipments coming in?" I asked, surprised, because it seemed like there were a lot of shipments coming in, judging by the number of queues we had already passed. "No," she said simply. And that's when it came crashing down on me. Hundreds of people had been queuing for days on end with no real proof that there was going to be a shipment coming anytime soon. They were so desperate that they were spending all this time in line with their families, hoping that a stray fuel bowser would pass them by. They were hoping against hope. No one had a choice. Because as June 2022 continued, Sri Lanka's balance of payments worsened, new credit lines had to be extended, and debt repayments were being pushed back, just so that my country could afford a few more shipments of fuel. Families were struggling to put food on the table. They were struggling to find transport to go to work, and children were simply not being sent to school. In my own family, I began to fear for their health. My father slept 4 hours every night, afraid that someone was going to break in and rob us. Every time I opened Twitter, there was new security camera footage of someone getting robbed on the streets. Videos began emerging of underworld members walking into tiny corner shops, killing the owner, and then looting the place. My family, of various ages and illnesses, began counting their medicine and hoping that it would last them until the end, whenever it was. And WhatsApp messages began streaming in from my grandma, warning me of the different scams that were circulating and the different prayers to pray for an end to what felt like a never-ending nightmare. Now, for many, it is incredibly hard to imagine what these circumstances look like. And maybe as you're listening to me speak, you're hoping that what I'm saying is exaggerated for higher views, for greater virality. The truth is, I wish they were too. Because as June 2022 stretched on, the humidity increased, the weather worsened, and people were struggling. Families were reduced to 2 meals a day at best, and children were being sent outside to beg. Under the boiling sun, people were forced to be outside, forced to ask others for whatever rupee they could afford to spare. Now, fuel queues were not spared either. Cars, tuk-tuks, motorbikes stretched on for kilometers, with not so much as an inch of movement between them. Many were spending 4 to 5 days in line, waiting in vain for fuel. And through it all, no one had the luxury of turning on their car's air conditioning. And so many were fainting in their cars under the aching heat. And then, the crisis became so unimaginably bad that over 13 people died in line. And yet, despite these overwhelming difficulties, hope was starting to be found. As these queues continued to grow, people began to step out of their houses with trays of cold drinks and food. There were so many stories that were accumulating. Offices and houses began opening up their doors and letting strangers walk in and use their washrooms. Families and friends began offering to stand in line for each other, offering to help out in whatever way they could, even if it was just with their company. When pregnant women and the elderly needed to be rushed to the hospital, neighbors and sometimes even strangers stepped up. They scrambled to the hospitals with whatever petrol they had left that they were saving for their own personal emergencies. As these queues continued to grow, stories like this multiplied. In the worst of times, Sri Lankans were finding a way to come together during this crisis. Now, stories of kindness like this objectively make no sense. During times of crisis, how could you afford to not be selfish? When resources are so scarce, if one person gets what you need, it means that you are left without. And when you are dependent on these resources, when you need them for your survival, it makes sense to be selfish, to keep it all for yourself, to refuse to share simply because you cannot afford to. It makes no economic sense to, and yet time and time again, people have shown compassion and care during these periods. Even in periods of tremendous and unimaginable hardship, especially in periods of unimaginable suffering and hardship. Now, stories like this rarely make local news, much less global. I wasn't reading of these stories on CNN or BBC, but I saw them all around me. Channels rarely ever show these stories of people mustering up the courage to be there for one another, even when they can barely be there for themselves. They treat them as isolated events, unremarkable, unnewsworthy. And yet, in times of crisis, like in Sri Lanka, these isolated, unremarkable stories are what saves lives. Today, Sri Lanka is a different Sri Lanka to what it was a year ago. And yet, it was built on the backs of the most intense passion and care by ordinary people. People who cared enough to push for change has resulted in what it is today. Community care and selflessness are sometimes the only reasons we're standing here today, alive. My country has endured tremendous hardship and shown tremendous care as well. And in the face of it all, we have shown tremendous resilience. When we are pushed down to the ground, someone, sometimes barely on their own feet, lends a hand and helps us back up. Now, I hope I leave you today with a better understanding of the importance of community, if anything. In this increasingly isolated, digitized world, it is easy to feel alone. Especially in the face of hardship, we may feel like we must struggle alone with the weight of the world on our shoulders and the feeling that there is no way out. And yet, whether we know it or not, we belong to communities. And for reasons that seem innate, biological, mystical, people often care. Somewhere, someone cares. And sometimes, that someone is you. Thank you.